and welcome to another episode of Bright Threads in the Tapestry. This is a series where I piece together the brightest threads from my favorite stories and analyze them to figure out what makes them shine. Today, I have a very special episode, and I've been planning this one for a very long time. I've been waiting for a special number, episode number, to put this one together. The topic is all the ways in which stories are meaningful to us. I have snippets from 5 different authors, I think, maybe 4. I'm not entirely certain at the moment, but I have 10 snippets from across 4 to 5 authors. Many of them are recent favorites or from series that I have become a big fan of in the last few years. The topic itself is special to me as a shy introvert for whom books have been the biggest source of comfort and joy basically through my entire life. I think it is nice to see that joy or notion of importance of stories expressed in words that are extremely eloquent and beautiful. And so I have been highlighting such passages as I came across them. It started with a snippet from Martian Sands by Lavie Tidhar, and I have since gathered 10, like I said, snippets to put together for this episode. Now, I said I'd wait for a special number. This is episode number 7 of this podcast or series on my YouTube channel, Reading by the Rainy Mountain, depending on where you're listening to this. And because I'm also publishing this as a podcast, I did a bunch of research on how to start a podcast. And one thing that repeatedly came up was that a lot of podcasts stop publishing episodes before the 7th episode. That's sort of the critical threshold beyond which I imagine podcasts tend to be successful, or at least they tend to continue on existing and publishing episodes, unless they're doing limited series, I suppose. Any that start as I'm going to do this for several years. 7 apparently is the critical number where they start to fall off. So this, I have published 6 episodes of Bright Threads, and this is episode number 7. So this is a I'm still here episode, if you will, which is slightly important right this moment because I have been somewhat erratic with the publishing schedule for this podcast. I intended for it to be bi-weekly or weekly if I could manage, but I haven't had a whole bunch of time to film. I have several ideas. I have plans for the next 6-7 episodes at least ready to go, and I have ideas for what comes next. Finding time has been difficult, but I'm working on it. I'm going to figure it out. But meanwhile, I'm still here, I'm not going anywhere, and I plan to continue this series through 2024. That's kind of the reason for this episode, and it's also kind of celebratory that I managed to keep it up for 7 episodes, though not on the schedule that I had originally planned. The authors from whom I have snippets today and the corresponding books that they are from. The first is Martian Sands and Central Station by Lavie Tidhar. I'm listing them in no particular order. I think I'll go through the snippets in whatever makes the most sense to have this episode seem cohesive. But right now, just in the order I'm remembering to talk about them. Lavie Tidhar for Central Station and Martian Sands. Stephen Erikson, I have some snippets from The Crippled God. Way of Edan by Dr. Philip Chase. I have a couple of snippets from there. Neil Gaiman from Sandman, the second book, The Doll's House. And yeah, that's it. Those are the 4 authors that I have snippets from today. Now, I will say that there are no spoilers for any of these series. There is one snippet that spoils something from The Crippled God. I will make sure to warn you before that snippet. But all of the others you can listen to without being spoiled for any of these books. So, like I said, the topic today is all the ways in which stories are important or meaningful for us. And I'll start with the clip, the snippet that uh, started all of this, started my collecting snippets about why stories are important. And that would be from Martian Sands. I'll read the snippet real quick and then I'll talk to you about it in just a second. This is a snippet from Martian Sands. Um, just a really quick, short line. What joins humans and others is stories. Intelligence is story. Otherwise, life just happens. A series of isolated presents, disconnected moments. Now, that little snippet talks about humans and others. I'll quickly explain what that means in the context of this world. Others are sort of these semi-digital sentient beings. They only have a digital existence, I think, but they are sentient. That's pretty much all we need to know to understand this. They're not human and they're sentient. That's all we need to know to understand this quote. And the main thing that stands out to me here is that what it says about intelligence is story, and otherwise life just happens. And what I think this will fit together with some of the other snippets that we look at later today, but this idea keeps coming up in all of the quotes I've collected, which is that we impose narrative on our lives, and that to a great extent is what gives us meaning in what we do every day. And I really resonate with and appreciate that notion. This is the first time when I came across this, is what was the first time I thought about it in those terms, but it made a lot of sense to me that the idea that intelligence or the intelligence story or the ability to tell and make up stories is what defines human or other intelligence, and vice versa, that the fact of intelligence allows us to impose narratives. So it's almost a little circular thing. Stories give meaning, meaning gives rise to more stories, meaning and understanding, which I thought was brilliantly put here. So the next set of snippets that I have 3 of them from Central Station, which is, I guess, for you could say it's the second book in the Central Station series, of which Martian Sands is the first book. At least that's how it shows up on Goodreads. They are both standalone novels, and Central Station is really it reads almost like a short story collection, and it sort of is. It's a narrative imposed on a set of short stories that have been put together into this novel, which again, piecing together snippets or small threads and building a larger narrative. I think that's really cool, and I thought Central Station did that really brilliantly, bringing everything together in the end. I mean, it doesn't have this big beginning, middle, and end. It's just following a bunch of characters around, but having the sense of a complete story that it's kind of really interesting how that's done in Central Station with putting together what were short stories, what were originally published as short stories. Now, the context that I will set for the next 3 snippets that we'll look at from Central Station, they all are focused on this character called Akimwene. What we need to know about him is that he owns a bookshop. I think, if I remember correctly, paper and physical books are pretty much gone from this world. So Akimwene basically owns some antique books, if you will. But whether or not that is true, he owns books that are hard to find. He sells them out of his shop, and most of it is pulp fiction. And all of all of this means is that he loves stories, and he tends to think of his life in terms of stories, and that's kind of what comes out in these snippets that we shall see. When I came to Earth, those few words evoked in Akimene a nameless longing, so much to infer, so much suggested to a man who had never left his hometown. Now, this snippet is from Akimene's conversation with a character who has come to Earth from a different part of the solar system. And what he says here, when he hears the words, when I came to Earth, the feelings that are evoked in him, what he says here about uh, having a nameless longing evoked in him, and that he has to infer uh, so much because he's never left his hometown. And I feel like that describes, in a lot of ways, how I feel, and I suspect a lot of readers feel when they read stories or even watch movies, experience stories in any way, things that are foreign to us, things that are different from what we are familiar with. It Stories open our minds in a lot of ways, I think, or help you keep your notions, whichever. There's many reasons to read, understand, assimilate, experience stories. And I just love how this has been put, about how there's so much to infer, so much we can get from stories, that we, or so much to think about, I suppose, from stories. The nameless longing, that feeling really resonates with how I feel when I read a story and I'm like, I wish I could experience that. I wish I was in that place, or I wish I had lived in that time period, which are thoughts I often have when reading stories that I really love and resonate with. So, first, the bit about the nameless longing, that really resonated with me. And then the other about how much we have to infer and fill in the gaps when experiencing any stories. He is talking about someone who's traveled from a different place, but again, that could be just as true for when we are um, assimilating stories in some form or the other. Now, on to the next Akimene snippet, where he actually does discuss how narrative is imposed on his life. Lavie Tidhar. It is perhaps the prerogative of every man or woman to imagine, and thus force a shape, a meaning, onto that wild and meandering narrative of their lives by choosing genre. A princess is rescued by a prince. A vampire stalks a victim in the dark. A student becomes a master. A circle is completed. And so on. It was the next morning that Akimweme's story changed for him. It had been a romance, perhaps, of sorts, but now it became a mystery. Perhaps they chose it, by tacit agreement, as a way to bind them, to make this curious relationship, this joining of two ill-fitted individuals, somehow work. Or perhaps it was curiosity that motivated them after all. That earliest of motives, the most human and the most suspect, the one that had led Adam to the tree in the dawn of story. Now, this snippet and the next one, they play with this very similar idea. The one I've already mentioned of imposing a narrative on everything that we do, which I suppose we all tend to do, whether deliberately or not. In some ways, we're all the central characters of our lives, and then people come in and occasionally you agree together to impose the same narrative on our combined stories or lives, if you will. And that's kind of the notion here. We are talking about two people here in question from this snippet, and based on how we look at it, we could, and I suppose this is a note both for the readers as well as a statement about the character and their relationship. The way to look at it could be a princess being rescued by a prince, or a vampire stalking a victim. I'm not sure. I read this book more than a year ago, I think, so I don't fully recall the student becoming a master, but how that is relevant here. But these are all different ways to look at this relationship between these characters. I think that resonated with me again because of how we look for meaning in stories. The Every story has so many ways you can interpret it. Each person has possibly a different thing that stands out for them, and the same is true for life in general, I suppose. So a lot depends on how you look at it and what meaning you can get out of the situation. And I thought that this was a really good way to put it, like a really beautiful and succinct explanation for it. The next snippet, once again, plays with the very same idea of how we impose how the what we get out of a situation depends on the story or narrative that we impose on it. So I will read it, but I don't have too much to add to it over what I've already said here. So from there, we'll move on to the next clip. Stories gave shape to Akinweme's life. Narratives gave a series of random events meaning. And so he shaped this too as a story. A man wakes in the night and finds his lover gone. He follows her. Where does she go? Read one way, this is a tale of everyday life, of love curdled, of quiet desperation. Read another, and it is a detective story, the mystery of the lover's disappearance needing to be solved, the hidden meanings of mystery put together. Now, this snippet is from the second book in the Sandman collection, The Doll's House. It is from the portion at the beginning of the volume that's recapping everything that happened in the previous book, which is Preludes and Nocturnes. And this snippet is one of those things that made me wish that I love the comic, I love Sandman, but it kind of made me wish that it would also be available in prose form or novel form because it was so beautiful how this was written. And I do plan to, I haven't listened to the audio version yet. I do plan to, if this is the kind of stuff that I can expect from the audiobook. So real quick, I'll do the reading and then we'll talk about why it's so wonderful. But of course, we never see the beginning. We come in the middle after the lights have gone down and try to make sense of the story so far. Whisper to our neighbors. Who's he? Who's she? Have they met each other before? We get by. In this case, let us imagine our neighbor to be tall, robed perhaps in old monkish garments, his face hidden in the shadows of his cowl. He smells of age and dust, not unpleasantly, and in his hands he holds a book. As he opens the book, leather-bound, undoubtedly, and every word in it traced meticulously by hand, we hear the clink of metal and realize the book is chained to his wrist. Never mind, we have seen stranger things in dreams, and fictions are merely frozen dreams, linked images with some semblance of structure. They are not to be trusted, no more than the people who create them. Are we dreaming? Possibly. But the man in the robe is talking. His voice is like the rustling of old parchments in a library, late at night, when the people have gone home and the books begin to read themselves. We strain to listen. The story so far. Now, I was just reading this yesterday because I'm reading Sandman for a discussion I have with a few folks on BookTube. But this is so beautiful, this this introductory passage. It first with this otherworldly image of this person hidden inside a cowl, with a book chained to his wrist, who at first I thought was Dream, because there is mention of what's happening here could be a dream. But it turns out, as we read on in this introduction, that it's actually destiny. And this is the idea that stories, um, that destiny is reading off of a book of stories of people's, which are in fact people's destinies. So that builds upon the idea that people's lives are stories, destinies reading to someone, you, um, from a book of stories, which are stories of the lives of some people that we met in the previous volume. And for all we know, they could be real, they could exist. And I love the ambiguity here. The it I think what we're going for is that we have entered a movie theater after the lights have gone down, and then we're asking the neighbors to catch us up, or at least asking questions because we came late, and so we want to know, we want some information from our neighbor, except our neighbor is this terrifying creature. But also, in the middle of this, we are dreaming. Are we dreaming? Possibly. And so it's unclear whether we are dreaming or not. So it sets a beautiful stage for what's to come next in this world. So I think it's written really beautifully. But the reason I included it in this particular episode of Bright Threads is how it talks about, I think in so short a space, it talks about a lot of the ways in which we experience stories. Someone reading to us, possibly before we fall asleep, that sort of really melts or dissolves into this notion that we might be dreaming, where in our dreams every night we experience a lot of stories. And then movies are a way to experience stories. So that's where it all starts. Someone's reading to us. And then there's these otherworldly creatures who, in a lot of cultures and religions, we believe that they exist or they don't. So we meet Father Destiny, I think, or Destiny, who supposedly keeps a record. And I'm not sure if this imagery of Destiny with a book chained to his wrist is from mythology or if Gaiman made it up for this comic. But regardless, I think it's both a wonderful and terrifying image. So the idea of predestination, that there is something written in the book, or it could be that the story of our lives is written as we go. Any number of those things. It has so many ideas about stories, about life, encompassed in such a short snippet. And it's so beautifully written, and it has this otherworldly feel about it. I had to include it in this episode. The next snippet is from The Way of Edan by Dr. Philip Chase. It's a fairly short snippet, I think. Well, I'll read it to you real quick, and then we'll talk about it in just a sec. So this snippet is from the first chapter of The Way of Edan by Dr. Philip Chase. It's immediately after a couple finishes exchanging stories. One of them has told the other a really sad story in which I think both people in a couple die. One of them by throwing herself on a funeral pyre. So, did she truly? Your head's full of sad old stories. Just don't expect me to throw myself on any fire for you. He held his hand over his heart in mock agony. This drew a giggle from Ebba, and they smiled at each other. You know, he said, those stories may be sad, but they are more than that. Oh, Ebba stuck her chin out and raised her eyebrows in challenge. How do you mean? Well, Dairavin thought a moment, and he grew serious. They tell us who we are and where we come from. That sounds like something Urd told you. Well, perhaps she did, but it's still true. If it's true, give me an example. Derwin grinned as he realized Ebba's cleverness in tricking a story out of him. She loved hearing him tell the stories he learned from Urd and from old women's books. He knew she was proud of her future husband's learning. Other than Urd and the local priest of the Way, who was from Torland, Derwin was the only one near Kinsford who could read. In truth, one of his chief pleasures was telling Ebba stories, and not only for the admiration. The tales brought them closer, as if they were entering a world he summoned only for them. After they were wed, he planned to borrow one of Urd's books and teach Ebba and their children to read. Very well, he said. As it happened, not long ago, I came across a tale in one of Urd's books that will serve. Now, this one resonated with me for two reasons. First is the bit about stories telling us who we are and where we come from. That really resonates with me, I think, especially coming from a culture where we have so many stories about all the gods and the demons, and all of that is handed down. That's what those are the stories I grew up on. Those are the stories my mother used to tell me when she was trying to get me to eat, and those are the stories that repeatedly I watch on television, that other stories from my part of the world are built on top of. They help me understand why we are the way we are, and why a lot of the customs we have, how they came about, and so on and so forth. So I think that resonates with everyone, and I think that's true for everyone, and I felt it to be true for me, so that bit resonated with me quite a lot. And then the other other cute portion of it, where Deiravin thinks to himself about how he wants to teach Ebba and his future children to read, so that they can read stories and experience them and learn from them the way he did. That is probably true for a lot of bookworms, but also very much true for me. Right from when I was, 15 years old, I had a bunch of books charted out for this is what I would like to share with my children if and when I have them. So I have a lot of stories marked out for that, for sharing with future children and my partner, stories that I love to share with him. I love watching movies with him in the evening, and experiencing stories together. This idea of reading and experiencing stories together as a family, I love that. It's very cute, and it brings people together. Stories do that, and I suppose you learn from them together, you grow together. There's so much that stories do for us, and I love how Dr. Chase has put it out in this segment. The next one is from, there is one more snippet coming up from The Way of Edan, but I'm sort of interleaving this in an order that makes the most sense. I'm imposing a narrative on this episode, if you will. So the next one is from the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which this is the clip that has a spoiler for the Crippled God. The next two clips from Malazan will not spoil anything. They do come from perspectives of characters that you may not have met yet. So if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, just maybe skip ahead for all the Malazan bits in this episode. The next Way of Edan clip is not spoiling anything either, because it's from the second chapter of the first book. So this extremely short snippet from the Crippled God that we're about to read, it's from the section where Badal and Sadik, I think, they are talking to the adjunct, or the adjunct is talking to the children after the snake has met the Malazan army, Tawor's army, in the glass desert. And Tawor, I believe she's gone to check on the children, and Breeze once they are done with their conversation, Brees Benedict bends down to help Sadik with all his collected junk, as Badal keeps thinking about them and is often angry about, because she thinks that it's an unnecessary burden for them to carry, for the snake, for Sadik to carry through the journey of the snake. And when he bends down, he tells Sadik, "Here, let me help you with your toys." And Badal realizes then that those were toys, that these two children had completely forgotten about this notion of toys. Now, remembering it, they then proceed to play for a bit. Badal joins Sadik in some games with his toys. So the conversation that the snippet that I'll read to you is Brees deciding the Malazan army has come to the very edges of tolerance. They're about ready to give up. They feel like they can't keep going through the glass desert anymore. And Brees says, "I'm going to go tell the story of these children to everyone to pump them up." And it works. It works. So I'll read the snippet and then we'll talk about it in a bit, in some more detail soon after. "No." And he pointed to Badal and Sadik. "I will go among the troops this day, adjunct, for I have a story to tell. 2 children, a sack of toys." She eyed him. "These children," he nodded. "These children." So that snippet I picked, one, because it's incredibly heartwarming, and I will do separate Bright Thread episodes both for that conversation and for the scene where the snake meets Tower's army, the Bone Hunters. That those 2 scenes were absolutely brilliant, and I need to talk about them in a lot more detail. But the reason I included that snippet here in this episode about all the ways in which stories are meaningful for us is how stories can is to talk about how stories can motivate us, how they can pull us out of holes or be there for us in difficult times, get us to do things that we may not be inclined to. Usually good, perhaps sometimes bad. The manga Berserk comes to mind for something like this as well. Just this character who's incredibly resilient through every bad situation that comes his way. That sort of thing makes you, as the reader, also feel more pumped about, like, if there's some hole that we are digging ourselves out of as well, there's more motivation to get through that. Or if not, just a feeling more pumped to get through life in general. I think stories add a lot of value there. Another example I can think of is The Wars of Light and Shadow, for instance, has a character who plays music really brilliantly, and every single time there is a scene that describes how he plays, it's so beautiful. Immediately I have to stop and go practice my instrument that I may have neglected in the recent past. So yeah, I think a lot of these motivational and inspirational bits of stories, what they can do to make things better, to make things seem brighter, I think is very, very important. So it made sense to include it here. Now, this next snippet, also from Malazan Book of the Fallen, is from Badal's perspective, but doesn't spoil anything. This snippet, I think, is a different perspective on why stories are important, and why it's important to not look away from certain types of stories. I'll read the snippet and be right back with you to discuss it. We go round and this is the story of the world. Do not flee us. Do not flee this moment, this scene. Do not confuse dislike and abhorrence with angry denial of truths you do not wish to see. I accept your horror and expect no forgiveness. But if you deny, I name you coward. And I have had my fill of cowards. So there are several instances through, I think, definitely the Crippled God, and I think sometimes through Dust of Dreams, where it feels like the author is talking to his readers through his characters. And there are definitely multiple instances where he does this through Badal, as and I'm interpreting it that way. I'm not entirely sure if that's how Erikson intended it to be, but it does feel like the author talking to the reader directly rather than the character to someone else. And I do have a Bright Thread episode planned to discuss all of those instances. But this one in particular, about which says, do not confuse dislike and abhorrence with angry denial of truths you do not wish to see. Or I accept your horror, and expect no forgiveness. So, and basically calling us a coward if we choose to turn away from this story. This story of the snake making its way through the glass desert is heartbreaking, and and I didn't fully realize just how much when the moment I'm going to talk spoilers for the Crippled God, when the moment that the snake meets with the bone hunters, I had to sit down and weep for a little bit. I didn't realize just how emotionally fraught this journey was, even for me as the reader. So just because that's causing these bad feelings or this discomfort, but I'll saying I do not give you permission to look away, and if you do, I'm going to call you a coward. that feels a bit like Erikson saying this story is important and you need to read about it and you cannot look away. It feels almost like that. But I think to that point, why this is in the all stories are meaningful discussion, it's just that there are some stories that no matter how unpalatable, we need to hear, so that we can prevent, if we have the power to, we can prevent other occurrences like this, to be familiar with them, to bear a sort of witness, if nothing else. This series plays with that notion quite a bit. And I think hearing stories like this, or reading stories like this, are one way to keep thoughts about these bad things happening alive, to try prevention at some point, if not immediately in our power, and among many other reasons why. But I thought this encapsulated that feeling, this snippet, really, really well. So the next snippet, the next two, the one is from The Way of Edan, the second chapter of The Way of Edan, and the one after that will be from the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Crippled God. And they are sort of grouped together because they discuss very similar themes when it comes to memory and stories. So we'll talk about the one from Way of Edan first, and then go to the Malazan one to close this out. Now, this snippet is from the second chapter of The Way of Edan, again by Dr. Philip Chase. It's introducing a character named Sequara. She's returned home after a period of absence, and she's reminiscing on her time here before her absence, I think. So the chapter is called Where Memories Dwell, which I think is a really beautiful name for a chapter. Anyway, scenes of Sequara's childhood flooded her mind along with an array of emotions, a poignant mixture of longing, affection, regret, and sorrow when the farm came into view. Much like every other home in the region, the humble farmhouse was built from the tan limestone predominating in Astralad's countryside, while the barn, which seemed in as much danger of toppling over as it always had, consisted of warped pieces of wood. Pulling on the reins, Sequara stopped her mare for a moment to observe the scene and the emotions alike. She had spent countless hours playing and working among the olive trees surrounding her, and the scent of the nearby sea transported her to those days so that their illusion of safety and untroubled peace pervaded her once again. For a fleeting moment, she was that girl again, innocent of the debts and duties that would take all this away from her forever. And yet, somehow, those days remained somewhere within her, in the place where memories dwell, or at least some imagined impression of them did. Fragments of images, sounds, and smells. She knew better than to trust them, for in the act of caressing them over the years, she had changed them. Each one was part of the fiction of her life, but in the realm of origins, she perceived the truth that such a life did not, in fact, exist, that it was a gentle breath indistinguishable from the endless air around it. Memories were all little lies strung together to confer the impression that a life had a story with its own meaning, that it existed apart from the energy whence it came, and whither it would return. Unlike most people, Sequara could not long indulge in such comforts. Now, I will talk in just a second about how this passage is significant for the topic at hand, but I do want to stop and smell the roses a little bit, if you will. I loved the descriptions at the beginning of this chapter. First of all, the name of the chapter, Where Memories Dwell, that is so pretty. It evokes strange emotions, I think. I love that. I love that it's almost like a poem title, I think. It's really beautiful. And then the beginning of the chapter does not disappoint. And I also like that it invokes the name of the chapter almost immediately. For some reason, that's nice. I like that. And here, the first sentence, it says, scenes of Sequara's childhood flooded her mind along with an array of emotions. And the list of emotions listed after that: longing, affection, regret, sorrow. All of these are so, just naming the emotions, and yet it evokes something because of what it's attached to. Someone coming home after a long absence. These are, I suppose, things that most people tend to feel if you're coming back home, unless you have like a completely happy association with everything. These are often, I think, very relatable emotions, either home or someplace that is missed, but also there's a little bit of sorrow or sadness associated with it. And then here again, for a fleeting moment, she was that girl again, innocent of the debts and duties that would take all this away from her forever. Now, I haven't finished this book. I picked up The Way of Edan a few months ago, and I could not give it dedicated time, and I felt like I was really appreciating it so much. I felt like I needed to read it with dedicated time for the book instead of like a snippet a bit here and there like I was managing at the time with all the commitments I had. So I do plan to pick it up again. I got as far as the 40th page or something like that, but I do plan to pick it up early in 2024. The reason I say this is that my memory might be vague about what is happening here, but I'm pretty sure this is where Sequara's character is introduced, and there's so much we find out about her. And already, I think within these 3 passages, there's enough here for me to build a connection with her. I don't know yet whether I should be sympathetic with the character, but So far, I agree with everything she's saying, and I think that's really cool. Anyway, coming to the part that is relevant to our topic, I think this bit where she says, um, those days remained somewhere with her in the place where memories dwell, or at least some imagined impression of them did. And she goes on to say memories were all little lies strung together to confer the impression that a life had a story with its own meaning. Now, yes, I will admit that I latched on to this bit for this topic because of its direct comparison of memories and how memories impose a story of onto our life. And that, I think, is directly uh, it relates to everything else we've discussed. Like a lot of the quotes that we looked at from Tidhar, for instance, where Akimwene talks repeatedly about imposing a narrative on the events that are currently occurring in his life on the past. And there is a theme that Tidhar explores about what memory can do to us, uh, and how that can suck a life up. And I will explore that in a separate bright thread for that topic. And I think this this passage may show up there again. But for the moment, speaking of stories, I think this one adds an element to everything else we've discussed so far. There is, of course, the Im- implication that memories, the way we string our memories together, the way we interpret them, um, is the same as us building a story about ourselves. Like, once again, that whole we are the central character, or we maybe even some cherry picking with the memories is involved, which ones we tend to remember and give importance to, and which ones we don't. But the word of caution here, I think that's important. And it's about memories here, but I think it applies to a lot to how we interpret stories, how we interpret even history, for instance, or lately, unfortunately, the news. So, uh, everything, it's the dangers of a single interpretation, or the dangers of not being open to the possibility that something is different than what we think it is. Um, that implication here, I think, is really important. Like, I think here, uh, memories were all little lies. I think the fact that it's called a lie, right? So that Akimwene had an almost romantic view of the imposing a narrative on stories aspect of his of his interpretation of his life. But here, it that's still true here, but and there is some romanticism here to how this is written, but it comes with a very important and very significant word of caution. The last one, the final one, goes in a similar vein, but it adds yet another layer to it that I think is really cool. And we'll talk about that in just a second. For we are all bound in stories, and as the years pile up, they turn to stone, layer upon layer, building our lives. You can stand on them and stare out at future's horizon, or you can be crushed beneath their weight. You can take a pick in hand and break them all apart until you're left with nothing but rubble. You can crush that down into dust and watch the wind blow it away. Or you can worship those wretched stories, carving idols and fascinating lies to lift your gaze ever higher, and all those falsehoods make hollow and thin the ground you stand on. Stories, they are the clutter in our lives, the conveniences we lean upon and hide behind. But what of it? Change them at will. It's only a game in the skull, shaking the bones in the cup to see if something new shows up. I imagine such games are liberating, and the sense of leaving oneself behind is akin to moving house. A fresh start beckons, a new life, a new host of stories, a new mountain to build stone by stone. So, this passage, once again, I think I chose to end with this because it feels like it's both restating what we've looked at. It seems to be making the same point as all of the other passages that we've looked at so far, and also making a new point, which we'll get into in just a second. So it does say we are all bound in stories, and as the years pile up, they turn to stone, and so on. So I think that we talked about how story is memory. Story could be history. The uh, the narratives we impose on our life as stories. Intelligence itself comes due to stories. Those are all points that the authors that whose passages we looked at previously seem to be making or made explicitly with their statements. And this one, I think, just from how it uses the word stories, I think it implies that in a broader sense, not just literal fiction stories, but stories as we tell ourselves about our lives, about the history, any mythology, whatever religious stories we tell ourselves, whatever things give rise to custom and ritual. Those are all stories, one way or the other. And I think this passage for me is really powerful because it's basically stating that we are empowered to change a story we do not like, or in, I think, a more base sense, something that a story that isn't right or should not be allowed to persist, I think, because it may not perpetuate the right ideals. Now, that in itself is fraught because what's right and what's wrong is a big question. But let's say you don't like something, it says you can crush that down into dust and watch the wind blow it away, or you can worship these wretched stories, carving idols and fascinating lies to lift your gaze ever higher. So I love that. I love that it says, again, interpreting stories as everything that we've looked at so far. Memories, which I guess in this case could be memories of yourself, how you feel about yourself as a person, perhaps, and your relationships. You can change the interpretation. You can build a new story by looking at it differently, or you can change, perhaps not history itself, but you can change how the history of your time looks from the future. Or you can just, in a literal sense, tell different stories than the kind that you may not appreciate. I love that this has so many layers to it, so much that can be interpreted from it, while while appreciating stories, while while discussing their pervasiveness and, in some sense, importance to us. It's also telling us you're not bound to them. We can change them if needed, which, again, because pretty much everything we do is story. I think Tidhar, I really agree with Tidhar when he sums it up, saying intelligence is story, given that nothing needs to be unchangeable. A fresh start beckons, like Erikson says, a new life, a new host of stories, a new mountain to build stone by stone. Yeah, so that was this Bright Thread episode. And like I said, this is an I Am Still Here episode. I am going to try to go back to a bi-weekly cadence for this series. The next few will probably continue to rotate amongst the 3 series that we've been looking at. Specifically, the next episode will be from the Fiona Mar Tapestry by Guy Gabriel Kay, and then we'll do Words of Light and Shadow, one more from Malazan, and then I will hopefully by then have done enough preparation to start including some other books as well. I mentioned one topic from Lavie Tidhar's book Central Station that I'd like to look at in more depth, and I think you may see a couple of passages from this Bright Thread episode resurface in that one because I think they are relevant. to that topic as well. And I read Perdido Street Station. I loved it. There are some topics there that I would love to do Bright Thread episodes on. And like I said, with the Edan trilogy, I've only read about 25 pages, but I've already got several sections marked off. So I'm hoping by the time I get to filming all of these episodes, I will have read enough of those books to start doing Bright Thread episodes for them, dedicated Bright Thread episodes. So, yeah, to summarize, we'll still mainly focus on the three big series that I started this podcast to discuss, but we'll start peppering in some other series as well. I hope everyone has a wonderful new year. Thank you so much for listening and for all your support. I really appreciate everyone who listens to even parts of this. And if you leave a comment, thank you ever so much. I get really nervous filming these, and it means a lot that you're watching, commenting, and whatever you do to support. It's been great. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next one.